Well, thank you all for joining us today. I'm here with Karl from nuTonomy, which, if you don't know, is a self-driving software startup that was acquired last fall by Aptiv. And unlike some of the other things we're talking about today, this isn't somebody who's just talking theoretically about self-driving cars. This is a company that is actually doing it. So thank you very much for joining us, Karl.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Let's get started today. Just talk about a little bit about your company. Mm-hmm. I know you announced some news today about a new testing. A testing site or expanding within a testing site. Why don't you start off? Tell us about that.
Yeah. So at nuTonomy, we're about 300 engineers. We have operations in Boston, in Singapore, in Pittsburgh, Santa Monica, Las Vegas. We got about 100 self-driving R&D vehicles on the road today. But the exciting announcement for us today was we announced a partnership and pilot in Las Vegas with Lyft. About 30 of our driverless vehicles are going to be operating kind of in and around the Strip, downtown, transporting passengers between the major tourist sites. So that's starting tomorrow. And this is open to the general public. So if you go to Vegas tomorrow and download the Lyft app, you can opt in. And then if there's a car available, you can take a driverless trip between points of interest along the Strip. It's going to be free for the next couple months, which is also a bonus. And the reason we're excited about this and that this is a big deal is because, as you just mentioned, it's one thing to focus on developing the software. That's important. But it's a huge ecosystem to actually get a driverless service on the road. There's the software, there's the hardware, the car itself, there's the cleaning, the maintenance, the operation. So we're learning about that whole end-to-end process.
Do you think this is the first time many of those consumers will ever be in a driverless car?
I think probably 99% of them it will be. We did something similar at CES in January, this past January. We had only 10 cars, but we transported passengers around the Strip. We had about 400 rides. The average ride rating, 5-star rating, it was like 4.99. People loved it. And the thing is, just about everybody out there has heard about driverless vehicles, but almost no one has experienced it. And getting in the car and seeing that steering wheel move by itself, it's kind of an uncanny experience.
Absolutely.
And we've been thinking a lot and talking a lot as an industry recently about safety. One of the big dimensions of safety is trust in the technology. And so we think it's in our interest to get as many people as we can into our driverless cars so that they can see that the technology is safe.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big questions. After the Uber crash a couple of months ago, after the Tesla Model X crash, which you could or couldn't argue, was a level of autonomy at least. How are you thinking differently about safety now, and how do you convince consumers that even with incidents like that, this is the direction to go in?
Yeah, it's a huge question. Again, even if you've got working technology, if the public doesn't want to use it, you don't really have anything. And so I think we need to do a number of things as an industry. I mean, the first thing we need to do, I think, is be a little more open, a little more transparent. I actually believe if people knew what the software goes through before it hits the road, they'd feel pretty good about things. I can tell you at nuTonomy what we do. When we have a new build of software, this happens maybe once a week. First, we test the software itself. We do unit testing and regression testing. We make sure the code's not going to crash. It's not going to seg fault on the road. You don't want that. And then we simulate extensively. We put that software, we put it through about 40,000 simulated scenarios, really challenging scenarios now in simulation to make sure that the software would behave in the right way were it to face that same situation on the road. And then we take the software, we put it on a car and take it to a closed course. And we do what we call maneuver testing. We have trained professional drivers behind the wheel of the autonomous car and other cars, and we put it through its paces in a variety of, again, kind of challenging and complex scenarios that we may even never encounter on the road. But we want to make sure we can pass that step too. And then only if we've passed all these stages does that software get tested on the road. And then when it's on the road, of course, we have a safety driver in the car who's watching the road, and we have an operator next to that safety driver who's watching the safety driver. So it's a real, I would say, belt and suspenders approach to safety. So I think communicating that to the public would go a long way toward instilling confidence. And we need to do a little bit better job of that as an industry.
Right. While we're talking about safety drivers, when that self-driving Uber hit and killed a pedestrian, there was a driver in that car. I know that nuTonomy suspended tests on Boston roads for a week. What did you do at that time, and what did you learn in that week?
Yeah, the city of Boston contacted us. We have a very close relationship with the city of Boston. In the cities we operate, our principle is to work closely with the relevant government authorities. We want to be partners with them as they learn about this technology and as we get it on the road. We think that's in everybody's best interest. So in Singapore, we have a great relationship with the Singapore Land Transport Authority. City of Boston, we work closely with the relevant agencies there. So they called us after the accident, and they wanted to talk about what we're doing. What would happen if a nuTonomy car was in an accident? What would the response be and the procedure and process be? And they asked us to pause testing while we talked about that, and they wanted to better understand the lay of the land. So, I thought that was quite reasonable. I think it's a reasonable response by the cities to want to make sure they have a clear understanding of kind of accident response. And I think one of the things we saw nationwide after the accident was that cities and states maybe took a pause and said, we need to better understand this technology and how we're thinking about regulation. One of the things we support as a company is what's called the AV START Act, which is a bill that's making its way through Congress and the Senate that would provide uniform guidelines around AV testing and eventual deployment. It's one of the few bills in government that's received almost bipartisan support, so that's a good thing. And it would basically kind of create a uniform 50-state regulatory framework, whereas today it's really a state-by-state patchwork of regulation.
Yeah, knock on wood, you don't need it, but if you did need some response in some kind of accident, what is the plan?
Well, we have a very detailed process about communicating, to the various stakeholders. Everyone involved, so they know what happened. There's kind of evolving procedure within every company, not just ours. I think eventually as an industry, again, this is a spot where we'll get to a uniform procedure, kind of post-accident. Driverless cars, like human-driven cars, will get in accidents. They're still subject to the laws of physics. They're still out there among other cars who sometimes do dangerous things. So as an industry, I think to our credit, we're not putting our head in the sand and saying these cars will never crash, because we know that's not the case. So we think about how to deal with the eventuality of the post-accident eventuality.
Yeah, and that's what we see now, that most of the crashes that involve driverless cars, other people hit them because the driverless cars are too safe. They stop fully at the stop sign.
Right.
They wait before they take a turn, and human drivers don't know how to deal with that.
Yeah, and I'll be critical of ourselves a little bit. They are acting by the letter of the law, right? The letter of the driving regulations. Humans don't always do that. They take maybe liberty when it's safe to do so. I think the first generation of driverless cars will be very safe and maybe overly safe in the sense that they'll follow this letter of the driving code. And I think as we as an industry mature this technology, they'll drive more and more like human drivers do. And I think that'll probably lead to fewer of these minor fender benders that we sometimes see on the roads today.
Right. What's your take on partial versus full autonomy? Are you in the camp of Elon Musk that you roll out autonomy as you get each step on the way to level 4, level 5, or does that create this messy middle where a car is somewhat autonomous but not as much as the driver might want?
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it, the messy middle. I think intuitively we would think, well, a fully driverless car, that's just the hardest problem there is. And anything short of that must therefore be easier, right, when the human's in the loop. But I could make an argument that, the fully driverless system, look, we as engineers, we can get our head around that. We can write down the equations for the system. We can talk about the feedback and the sensing and all that. And if we get it right, that car should behave as we designed it to, and it should be safe. Now, when you've got a human behind the wheel, that human is unpredictable. That human can do anything at any time. And that's very hard to deal with from a technical perspective. So you could make a solid argument that developing what they call level 3 systems, where the human is sometimes responsible and sometimes can let the software take over, you could argue that that's actually a more difficult technical problem than the fully driverless system. Now, is there a place for systems like that? Sure. As a driver assistance tool, there is. But the hard thing is to ensure that, A, the driver is going to use it correctly, right? They're going to be attentive when they need to be and basically follow the operating procedure that's intended by the designers of the technology. And then B, when you have to get that driver's attention, you can do so, and you can do so predictably. And that's really difficult.
Now, what do you make of LiDAR? There's a discussion in the industry about whether or not it's needed. Tesla, not to make this a Tesla talk, but has said it's not. Almost everyone else is using it. Seems to work well, but is also pretty expensive and maybe makes a car inaccessible to your everyday consumer. How do you think about that technology?
So LiDAR, it's a laser-based technology for perception. This is a really hard problem. it's hard no matter what technology we throw at it. And so my belief, our belief, is that we should use whatever is at our disposal, whether that's LiDAR, radar, cameras, some exotic new perception technology. Everything is fair game because the reality is we're still trying to get the stuff to work reliably. So by removing some of these potential useful technologies, it just makes our problem harder. That's kind of one dimension. The other dimension is safety, again. What LiDAR gives you, what these sensing modes gives you often is redundancy. So when you're driving down a road and there's, let's say, a cyclist, you see that cyclist with your cameras, you can maybe detect that cyclist with your radar, and you can also image it with your LiDAR. And having that redundancy is, I would say, not just a nice to have, but actually essential.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the decision to test driverless cars on 2 different continents? What are you learning in Singapore that is different than what you're learning in the United States?
Yeah, so this is, I know, a startup-focused conference. When we were a startup, we did something that felt kind of crazy, but turned out to work pretty well for us. We launched almost simultaneously in Cambridge, Mass, and in Singapore, so literally halfway around the world. But the reason we did it, we had, I think, a reasonably good justification for it. Singapore is one of the world's most pro-autonomous vehicle countries, in the world. They're really supportive of the technology, provided financial support and governmental support for us to get on the road quickly. So it turned out to be a great place to launch a company focused on AV. Now, what you learn by testing in 2 radically different environments, right-hand drive, left-hand drive, Singapore drivers who follow the rules, Boston drivers who, sometimes you
I've
learn
driven in
about
Boston. Never do they follow the rules.
Yeah, so you learn about the breadth of what can happen on the road. And we're designing a technology that's intended for global application. There is some risk that you can get your technology working in Austin or Palo Alto or San Francisco, but you don't consider things that you might see in, Coventry or Paris or Moscow. And so we want to, as broadly as we can, expose our car to the different use cases and operational cases. And we're quite convinced that's going to give us a more robust and safer system down the road.
How about consumers? Are Americans more or less willing to get in a driverless car than somebody in Singapore?
Everyone's interested. I can tell you in Singapore, I don't know if it's a more, tech-forward society. I don't want to generalize too much, but there's, I would say, intense interest in driverless technology. There's also, the government has a strong role in shaping certainly policy, of course, but also public opinion. The government's very supportive of the technology, so there was kind of a interest and willingness on behalf of the public. I think in the U.S. we'll see a little bit more skepticism. I think once people, again, experience the technology, they'll be all in. That's what we've found so far. But I think there'll be the whole spectrum, whereas in Singapore it was a little bit more, tech-friendly.
Yeah. And we're here talking today about safety, but you're also a company and you want to make money. Can you talk a little bit about some ways that you can make money off of AV technology, like data monetization? If your self-driving cars see a pothole in the middle of the road, is that something they could report back, and could you get paid for that?
Yeah, a self-driving car cruising down a road in New Orleans will capture more and denser information about the streetscape that has ever been collected, in human history, right? But with that said, you need to be very careful when you think about monetizing information, especially as it relates to personal information about someone riding the car or someone just walking on the sidewalk. So we think about this, of course. I mean, you think about all the different possibilities of, making use of the assets that this car will generate, but we're proceeding very carefully. So in Vegas, I mentioned the pilot we're doing with Lyft, where we're going to be giving people rides. It'll be free for a few months, and then after that, we'll be collecting revenue as Lyft driver would do today if you took them from the convention center to the airport. It's a good way to make money. Are there other ways to do that, beyond just, a fee per kilometer? There certainly are, but we're going to proceed very carefully in that direction.
Now, you were acquired a couple months ago by Aptiv. Not to put you on the spot, but I will probably ask you in a couple minutes, a lot of startups here are looking to be acquired. Any advice you have on that account? But my first question is, why partner with a parts maker as opposed to an OEM, a Ford, a General Motors? So
Aptiv, they're a tier 1 supplier, a parts maker, as you say. They provide technology to car makers. They're about a $25 billion company. But they sit in this really interesting spot, in my opinion, and this is why we were attracted to the company in large part. They supply core technology to all the automakers. So it's not a single automaker who can put a single branded AV on the road. they can work with many automakers to put cars on the road in every country around the world. And we saw that kind of neutral status as being really powerful. We also really clicked with the management team and thought it was going to be a great home for our employees. Advice for startups, I would say the best advice I got as a startup who as we knew there was a potential exit through acquisition someday, but the advice was don't design your company to be acquired. The fit between an acquiring company and the startup is so kind of bespoke. There's no way you can design your company with an acquirer in mind because you don't know who that acquirer is going to be. So, build your business, run your company to be as successful as you can, put a mark on the industry, and then, something good will follow.
Yeah. Now, as far as other partnerships, you're partnering with people like Lyft. In some scenes, these might be seen as a competitor, but you're working together. Mm-hmm. I mean, in the AV world where everyone is working towards the same thing, how do these tie-ups help, and might you end up working with a future rival?
Yeah, it speaks to the really evolving nature of the autonomous vehicle space. There are companies developing autonomous technology who, if I had told you 5 years ago they'd be doing this, you'd say you're crazy. I mean, Apple is developing AV technology. Samsung previously was in auto, but not recently. And so, companies see this massive opportunity. They see a global multi-trillion-dollar opportunity, and I don't blame any one of them for wanting to get into the game. But you're right, you're partnering with a company one day, and the next day they make an announcement, and they have another partnership or an internal effort, and you realize you may someday be competitors. It's so early in the game that I think it's, we err on the side of not drawing hard boundaries. We try to find ways to work with just about anybody, and there are ways. You can firewall things, you can work together in certain areas and not work together in others. We're just trying to put together the right constellation of partners so that we can get a service on the road as quickly as we can. And Lyft is a fantastic partner, one of the marquee brands in ride-hailing and actually reaching the customer. When you want to pick someone up, they've got an app in their pocket. It's very hard to get your app onto many, many phones if you're an unknown brand or a brand with little, let's say, consumer recognition. But everybody knows Lyft, and so they've been a great partner for us, and we look forward to working with them for a long time.
Yeah, well, we have 1 minute left. I'm just going to wrap it up by asking, with all these new players jumping in, you've been doing this for years. You started this company at MIT a long time ago. With all that experience, what do you wish you had known then that now you know about AVs?
About AVs? I think the one thing that I knew, which I'm glad about, I had an appreciation for how hard it was, and I think that served us pretty well. I don't think we had an illusion about how quickly we would get on the road and how quickly we would be able to develop a product, and I think that's something that maybe some of our competitors didn't fully appreciate. But I will say that one thing I underappreciated was the complexity of taking that software and actually getting it on a car and then thinking about getting it onto hundreds of thousands of cars. We tend to think that's the easy part, the nuts and bolts part, but that's really, really hard. And we're in the thick middle of that process today.
Great. Well, we wish you luck, and thank you for joining us at Collision today.
Great. Thank you.